Right before we jump into this video, if you'd like me to send you this free guide to capturing motion in low light situations, just look for this orange box over on the website, put your name, email address in it, hit send it, and I'll send you that guide for free. Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com, and I want to show you how you can cheat at photography and how I had to cheat at photography the other day when photographing bowling. Now, it was super dark at the bowling alley. I even asked them if they could turn on more lights. They turned on the lights and I was like, do you have any light that hits their faces? Because I'm gonna need some light in their faces. And they're like, no, we don't have any other lights. So this was the results. This is how dark it was. You can see there is no front light. There's no light in their faces at all. So I have a tough decision to make. Do I bump the ISO super duper high to try and give myself something that's going to be brighter? Do I drop the shutter speed lower to let in more light? Do I open the aperture even more? Well, here's what I ended up doing. I ended up shooting at 1/400th of a second at f1.8 at 6400 ISO. Now, I was using the Sony A1 and the 135 1.8 lens. Now, you may have a 50 1.8 lens for your system. They're not terribly too expensive, and in this case, you could have used something like that. Now, let me explain to you why I chose these settings for this particular image. One, because I knew that I want to freeze the action. I didn't want blur. And I know that 1/250th of a second may be the slowest I can go in certain action situations without getting any motion blur. But because there's an approach and they're walking forward and they're throwing a ball pretty fast, I didn't want to risk getting any motion blur, so I went to 1/400th of a second. I went wide open on the 135 1.8, which is 1.8, because I know that the A1 can lock onto the eye and track it without any issues, even at 1.8, and I chose 6400 ISO because I didn't want to go to 10,000 or 12,000 or anywhere higher because it would just end up looking like Swiss cheese. So this is what it ends up looking like when I process it in Lightroom. I ended up basically 2 stops off. You can see that I'm at +2 on the exposure, and now it actually looks like a usable image. Some people might say, but look at all that noise and grain that you introduced. And you're absolutely going to introduce noise and grain as your exposure is off. So that's why I'm like, hey, shoot raw for one, but if you can get your exposure as close as possible in camera to the proper exposure, and you don't have to tweak much in the way of exposure after the fact, you're gonna have much cleaner files. But that doesn't work in every situation. Case in point, the situation I was in at the bowling alley. So I chose to go with a exposure that I knew was going to be wrong. I knew that I was about 2 stops off. My reasoning is that I'd rather keep the ISO a little lower and bring it back in post than raise the ISO 2 whole stops, which you're gonna see in a second is really high, and most people's cameras don't even go that high, and then I could just bring it back after the fact and deal with the results after. And I'm actually pretty happy with the results. And yes, if you zoom into 100% on a 50 megapixel file, you're gonna see noise and grain, but hey, I have a picture right here. I printed it out. It looks great. You have to get like this close to even start to see some of the grain. So don't fall into that pixel peeping issue that a lot of people fall into. Let's look at these settings and see where we're at. So we've got 1/400th of a second, 1/400th f 1.8 at ISO 6400. I was off by 2 stops. So what would my exposure have had to have been in order to get the image that's on the screen right now this bright? Well, let's just say we're gonna stay at 1/400th of a second. We're staying at f1.8. We were at 6400, but we need to go up 2 stops. 1 stop, double it, is 12,800. You're gonna introduce a lot of grain at that. Next, we double it again. We're at 25,600 ISO. And my camera can handle 25,600 ISO, but I feel that I'm better off underexposing by 2 stops and doing what I call cheating the system and bringing it back after the fact, I still think I will have a cleaner image by doing that than maxing out to 25,600. Actually, the camera goes further than that, but not everybody's camera goes to 25,600. If you have a DSLR that's, say, 5 years old or 4 years old, it may only go up to 6,400. Or maybe 12,800 at the most. So this is just explaining to you how you can build the exposure. So 1/400th at f1.8 at 25,600 ISO would have given me this exposure right in front of you. Let me jump in here real quick because I want to show you this photo taken with the Sigma 150 to 600 and edited with FroPak 3. Let's start with Prestige Worldwide. Boom, 1 click and it looks great. Followed by November Rain, gives you a really interesting look. Then we've got King Contrast, which really boomifies and brings out that contrast. And then, if you want to get creative, we've got one called Capone. But now I want to show you one of my favorite presets from FroPak 1 called Skittles. With 1 click, boom, it looks great. All I need to do is pull back on the yellow, and now I think it's perfect. So if you're looking to speed up your raw workflow or give yourself a great starting point, we created 15 all-new custom Lightroom presets that you can check out right now at FroKnowsPhoto.com/FroPak3. While you're over there, you can play with the sliders to see the befores and the afters, and if you decide that they're for you, they are currently on sale. Or if you want to grab Skittles in FroPak 1, you can get the FroPak Triple Play Bundle with FroPak 1, 2, and 3 at a special discounted price. Now, let's get back to the video. Now let's take it back to the beginning. 1/400th, 1.8 at 6400 ISO. Now, what if we went 2 stops with the shutter speed? 1 stop is 1/200th, 2 stops is 1/100th at f1.8 at 6400 ISO, and what's gonna happen is you're gonna get motion blur. You're not gonna freeze the action that you're looking for. Now, you can freeze the action if the person is at the very end of their motion. If they're like, or they're at that peak action, at the peak moment. Like if his arm finished here and stayed here, and his other arm stayed back here, and he didn't move for a fraction of a second, and you shot it, you could absolutely freeze it right there. But you're not gonna freeze the main action if there is some movement. So that's why I chose to be at 1/400th of a second at 1.8 at 6400 ISO. So I hope this has helped you out. And I know that the questions are gonna be, well, what about noise reduction? There's software out there that helps you reduce the noise. And I am not a fan of noise reduction. Actually, Lightroom has some pretty good noise reduction already built in, but what does noise reduction do? It softens that noise, which makes your image look smoother, but it just loses that sharpness. So I personally don't do any noise reduction. I don't buy any software that is marketed to me to do noise reduction because I honestly don't think you need it. I think that it's better to get your exposure as close as possible, unlike I did in this situation because it was an extreme situation and you don't have to worry about noise. Also, a lot of people worry about noise because they're zooming in to 100% and not realizing that this is a 17 by 22 inch print, and there you don't actually see noise, even when I'm shooting at 6400 ISO and being off by 2 stops. If I got a magnifying glass out, I could see that noise. But I'm not gonna do that. You have to understand that noise and grain isn't that big of a deal at the end of the day. The ways to make sure that you don't get a lot of noise is don't get your exposure off by far. Don't crop a ton. The more you crop, the more you blow up the pixels. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Just one of those teachable moments where we build the exposure and just explain how the situation was and how I captured what I captured. But again, there was no front light, so I did what I thought I needed to do to get the shots. Oh, and one other thing that I should mention is that these people, when I deliver them these photos, they have no idea what noise and grain is. They don't sit there and go, hey, why do I see some dots in the image? They don't. The general public has no clue what they're looking at. These guys, I already sent it to them, know that this is them. They don't get to see themselves bowling often. They didn't sit there and say, why were you off by 2 stops? No, because they don't care. All they care about is that I went out and took pictures of them bowling, and they're like, wow, these are awesome shots. And that's what they said. So that's where I'm gonna leave it, guys. Thank you very much for watching. Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.